If you're familiar with the channel, you know that I've been shooting with the Nikon ZF for the last 6 months or so, and I've been really loving the experience on like the dials and the retro design, but also adapting other lenses, not just manual lenses, but like my Sony glass to it. So I was really curious on adding another Nikon body to the kit because I really love the way the JPEGs look like. The raw files are really easy to work with. So once Nikon announced the Nikon Z6 III, all the video features along with a lot of the photo stuff that I already love about the Nikon ZF made me really interested to add this to the kit for the next wedding season. So today's video is gonna be more of an unboxing slash first impressions video, especially because I wanna see how different it is from the Nikon ZF. I don't see a lot of this stuff online, so I just wanna have that reference for myself. So I'm gonna be comparing it to the ZF in terms of like the handling and well, what differs between the two cameras. Okay, so Nikon Z6 III or Nikon Z6 III. And to be honest, the reason why I picked up this camera so late in the season was because of all the deals I saw online. I'll list a couple in the description below, but the reason I got this camera specifically was because I was able to get this at retail price with a CF Express card, another additional battery, and an adapter. So to me, that made the price worth it because I was gonna buy that stuff anyway because I don't use CF Express for my A7 IV or my other cameras. So to me, it made a lot of sense, and I still do have some shoots till the end of the year, so this is gonna get some good use for that. So this is gonna be primarily my work camera, and with most of my cameras, I wanted to have dual purposes that be good for photo, for video, and occasionally for me to use it for family events and stuff. Okay, so we have the usual USB-C cable, a bracket, a Nikon strap, which no matter the camera brand, I never put the strap that it comes with. They always live in the box. Yeah, I just don't find them that comfortable, and I really like my leather looking straps. We have the Nikon EN-EL15C battery. And now I have a bunch of these since I'm now a Nikon shooter. So yeah, apart from that, I think that's everything. It's a pretty short unboxing. Nikon Z6 III. And I gotta say, first impressions, I never actually held this camera. It feels both smaller and bigger than my Sony A7 IV, which I don't know how to describe it. Like, it feels shorter, but also the grip feels more substantial, which I really like. I mean, I have relatively small hands for most people, so most cameras to me are pretty comfortable in the hand, even like the Nikon ZF, and mostly because I don't put a lot of big lenses on it, but I really like the grip on this. And the materials that they use, I really love the look of this. And to be quite honest, like Nikon never really interested me my whole professional career. My father-in-law has always been a Nikon shooter. Every camera he's ever owned is a Nikon camera. And when I started my photography career, well, the only camera I could afford was the Sony A6000, and it kind of snowballed from there. So I was already familiar with Sony, so I went from the Sony A6000 to the Sony A7 II, then the Sony A7R II, the A7 III, so on and so forth. So I've always been a Sony shooter, and then my other camera that eventually I ended up getting was the Leica Q2. So Nikon was always like kind of in the background, but ever since the ZF, like I've been really looking forward to trying more Nikon cameras. And so once this camera was announced, I really wanted to see what kind of Nikon brought to the table, especially for video. For me as a videographer, 10-bit video is really important. And not knowing that not only does this camera have 10-bit video, but raw video, and now since they bought Red, they have all those resources that Red brought to the table. So knowing that I can do all that in such a small camera really piqued my interest. Another thing as a video shooter that I really like is this flippy screen. Most cameras that I own, I prefer to have a flippy screen, not because I do YouTube videos and I can see myself, but it's really useful when I'm shooting video, especially for like a gimbal work. Actually, every single camera that I own has a flip out screen, mostly because I do like to fly them on a gimbal and it's a lot easier to maneuver that way. These days, it's like more of a toss-up. I try to go handheld mostly, but it is a good option to have and it's not something I mind. Ideally, what I would love is to see the implementation of like the Sony new screen design that they have where it flips out, but it also goes up. I believe it's like a 4-axis design for the flip out screen. So I would love a lot of the new modern cameras to kind of have that. I don't know if Sony has a patent on it, but I really like that this camera has the same design language as like the Sony a7 IV and then the Nikon ZF. So yeah, the hinge feels nice, robust. Feels more like a mirrorless camera than the ZF. I really like this wheel. Like my biggest gripe with Sony a7 IVs, like I love them. I love the images that I get for both photo and video. I'm really happy with the dynamic range. Everything about it is amazing. What I do not like is the way the body feels like. The grip on it feels really plasticky. The EVF and the screens, they're not my most favorite screen in EVF to shoot on because I don't find them very accurate and the color shifts all over the place. So it's not an experience I've ever enjoyed. So while I love them, they're really reliable. They're workhorses. I'm always happy with them. I've never actually enjoyed the process of shooting with these cameras. But so I hope that the Nikon ZF or the Nikon Z6 III changes that, especially because so far I really like the way this body feels. As I can tell, there's a bunch of different buttons. I'm gonna look through it and see how much I can customize. There's an ISO dedicated button, an exposure comp button, a dedicated video button or record button. There's 2 custom buttons in the front, which is cool. A video and photo mode switch, which is great. Oh, and I appreciate that they have custom buttons here, custom options here on the wheel. That's great to see. For this camera, that's a little different. I do not own any CF Express card, so I got one luckily with the package I bought. So I'm not super used to shooting with CF Express, but as I can tell here, for photo specifically, I can write to both the CF Express and to the SD card, which is great. For video, I would love some redundancy, but since these are gonna be kind of like my backup cameras for video in terms of like weddings, so like not primary angles, but secondary angles, so I don't really mind it. I've never actually had an SD card go bad or corrupt, knock on wood. So it's not something that really worries me, but I would love to be able to write to both cards, hopefully with a firmware update eventually. I know there's a limitation with the components are in here. So yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see if they're able to kind of address that in the future, especially because I know there's no Nikon cameras who write to both cards in video, as far as I know. Let's put a lens on this. This is the 28 2.8 Nikkor lens, and it still keeps the whole kit relatively small. And the reason I have this version versus the one they made specifically for the ZF was just money. I was being cheap and it was like $50 less, something like that. So I was like, I like the design, but I'd rather save a little bit of money on that. I think what adds a little bit to the bulk of it is just its grip, which I'm okay with because as a work camera, having a comfortable grip is pretty important. The ZF, it's something I use for fun as a secondary camera. It's always in a harness, so it's not really a big deal. But in terms of size, it's not too bad. It feels very comfortable to my Sony a7 IVs. And what I was really curious on was like this EVF that I keep hearing about. And oh shoot. Oh wow. That is bright. Wow, people were not exaggerating. That is, holy smokes. That is a bright EVF. Wish there was a way for me to like show you how bright this EVF is, and I'm not even exaggerating, it's like ridiculous. I mean, I would never use it at the highest setting, but man, it's from memory, if memory serves, my ZF's brightness goes all the way to 5, like +5, and this one goes all the way to, it's like +5 all the way to high 2. It's like another 7 settings after that. So they weren't lying when they said this is the highest, the brightest EVF they've ever made. I still can't get over this EVF. It's ridiculous. Wow. And I'm a pretty big EVF shooter for weddings. I'm always behind the camera. Find it that it's more disarming. Like people don't feel as awkward if I'm like behind the camera. When I'm shooting with like my Q2, I feel like that's the most disarming because it's such a small camera and it's kind of offset a little bit, so I can interact a little bit more. But in terms of shooting with the EVF, I'm really looking forward to shooting with this one. Okay, let me take this lens off and we can compare the Nikon ZF to the Nikon C6 III. In terms of like design and weight and all that. Okay, we can put this one aside for now. So here's the Nikon ZF, and you know, people say that it's a big camera all the time, but when you don't have anything on it or a small lens, it's a pretty compact camera. In terms of a full frame camera, it's relatively small. Like it still shoots 10-bit video, beautiful JPEGs, shoots in RAW, micro SD to SD card. So it's still a great camera. So let's compare the size to difference in terms of both of these cameras. So as you can see, the width is pretty substantial, especially because of this grip, but it's a trade-off I'm willing to make, especially for a work camera, as I said. So the difference in size is not super drastic, especially if you look at them this way. And honestly, I think it's super cool that a camera manufacturer is still innovating like the Nikon Z6 III, but also has some fun with other cameras like the Nikon ZF. So catering to different types of photographers, I think goes a long way, especially since I'm a big believer now that there are no bad cameras, especially modern cameras. They all are relatively the same. A lot of them share the same sensors. They have similar specs. It's all about what you want as a photographer and just sticking to it. So for me, I've never been like a big Canon shooter. I've tried those cameras. They're not for me, but people that shoot with Canon on a regular basis, they love the shooting experience with Canon cameras. I love the shooting experience with Leica, the Leica Q2. For me as a working photographer and as an event photographer, it doesn't really make sense to go all in on Leica, especially because of the cost. So I've always stuck to Sony, but I think this is a good middle ground for me, to be honest. Having a nice, fun camera to take everywhere with me, as well as a workhorse camera that has everything I need for photo and video, but also can serve as a fun camera as well, or like a family camera. So in terms of the weight, it's negligible. Like for me, weight is never a big deal in terms of whether or not I'm going to carry a camera. I was never a DSLR shooter, so I don't have a point of reference to that. Maybe I would speak differently, especially because for me, whenever I'm shooting with these for fun, they're always small lenses. And if it's a zoom lens, it's a pretty small one. I have a 28-75 that I shoot with all the time. So yeah, all of my lenses are pretty small, apart from my 35-150. So yeah, in size difference is not very different, but I love the design language where you kind of see like where it starts and where it ends in terms of like the Nikon design language. So yeah, if you're curious at all what that looks like, this is the Nikon ZF and the Nikon Z6 III. So like obviously the dials are a lot different. Like the ZF has these like retro brass dials on the top. I love that it has that dial that I'm really used to with other cameras, as well as these two scroll wheels in the front and back. I'm gonna try to make a video, a long-term review later on, just so I can get a better feel of what this camera can do. But yeah, I really like the differences between these two. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to shooting around with this camera for both work and some like light fun as I test it out. And to be honest, the reason why I picked up the Nikon Z6 III in the first place is how well it can fit into my other ecosystem, which is the Sony. Ever since I figured out that I could adapt all my Sony glass to a Nikon camera, especially how well it did with the Nikon ZF, I really wanted to try it out with a more modern body because of how much I like the shooting experience. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. I get the high video bit rates that I like with Sony plus more, and also the handling of Nikon cameras, which I really, really like. So for example, there's this adapter, it's called the Megadap adapter, which I use to adapt all of my Sony glass to the ZF. And look how tiny this thing is. It's super thin, so it doesn't take much to be able to adapt. So this is a Sony 35 to 150. Well, it's a Tamron lens for the Sony E mount, which the biggest reason I felt comfortable adding this to the kit is I don't have to buy a new set of glass for just specifically for the Nikon. I do own a couple of Nikon lenses, the 28mm as well as the 35 f1.4, but adapting like my zoom lenses has been a lot of fun, and this adapter has performed really well with the ZF in event work for both photo and video. And it's still, this adapter still has those markings so you can see where you're adapting your lens to, especially because if you're familiar with Nikon, you turn your lens the other way than you do with like a Sony body, which I had to get used to. I'm used to it now, but it was so hard to remember in the beginning. So as you can see, it's right on it. And catches on right away. So for me, that's one of the biggest advantages of adding Nikon cameras to like my Sony kit. I can still use my Sony glass, and the adapter added millimeters of depth to this. So it feels like a native lens. It doesn't cost me anything extra. This specific adapter is pretty expensive, but I think it's worth it to be able to adapt all of my Sony glass. And if I ever do decide to jump to Nikon from Sony altogether, it'll be gradually and not all at once. So I don't have any shoots until next week, but I still want to get some sample shots for you. So I'm gonna go out tonight, get a couple extra shots and see my findings and what I find that I like about this camera or not. Okay, so I came outside to get some sample shots with the 35 on the Z6 III, but I think I'm gonna be using this 35 to 150 instead because it's primarily the way I'm gonna use it, especially for events. So I'm curious how it's gonna perform with the adapter, especially since I also did a test with the Sony 20mm f1.8 with this adapter, and it was hunting quite a bit, which is not something I experienced with the Nikon ZF. So I'm curious on how it actually is affecting it, or if it's just that particular lens. So that's basically what I'm doing right now. So like significantly bigger, but we'll see. So after shooting with the Nikon Z6 III for about 30 minutes, I can say it's pretty familiar with the Nikon ZF, to be quite honest, which is what I was looking for because I just wanted that exact same experience-ish, just for like a workhorse camera than the ZF. Obviously the grip is a lot more substantial, so it's a lot more comfortable, especially with longer lenses, which I've been testing out the 35 to 150 with the Mega Depth adapter. And I'm happy to report that the autofocus is still pretty snappy with that 35 to 150. I think maybe there's something to do with like the algorithm with the autofocus with the 20mm that I can't figure out. I'm still gonna play around with that lens and see if it's user error or is kind of like a limitation of the adapter. So if you want to hear my thoughts on the adapter itself, I'm gonna do a dedicated video on the adapter later on. But so far, I really like the camera. I think it's gonna make a great addition to the kit. All the photos and videos that I've taken for the last 30 or so minutes, they're nothing special, and they're not supposed to be like, oh, look here, look, buy this camera. But more like it's my first impressions on shooting with the camera. If you're familiar with Nikon, you know that the Nikon colors are really beautiful, especially in the fall, which we have a lot of here. So yeah, this was mostly for me to kind of get a feel of what the camera feels like in just a casual setting, because it is going to be a work camera. I don't want to just use it for an event or a job for the first time. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more about what I think about the Nikon Z6 III, I'm going to make a review later on in the month, probably month in review, maybe a 6-month review. So yeah, if you like this video, please don't forget to like, and if you're not subscribed yet, please subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll see you next time. Bye.